Hey everybody. A few days ago I talked about framing devices briefly. I'd like to talk about them more concretely because they're very powerful tools. Let's talk about the kings of reframing, and that would be the RPG. In an RPG, the combat is the core gameplay. It's not the best gameplay, it's not the most interesting gameplay, but at the end of the day, everything you do in an RPG comes down to, can you live through this fight? So the fighting is the core gameplay. To keep that gameplay interesting, RPGs use a framing device, and the most basic framing device is the dungeon. So if you're in like a dungeon, something shaped roughly like this, for example, you will feel differently about the fights as you move through the dungeon. How? Well, let's say you're over here. You're at the entrance, and there you're thinking, oh, we're just getting started. Why don't we grind for a while? Because we're so close to home. And when you go into the fight, you're thinking, yeah, I got in a fight. And I'm going to go ahead and during the fight, I am going to use up all of my mana because I don't need it. I can go back and heal. And then when we come out of the fight, yeah, I got $1,000. You have a specific set of priorities. You go into the fight feeling something, you fight the fight feeling something, and you come out of the fight feeling something. On the other hand, let's say you're over here, down at the end of a really, really long and dangerous corridor, and you've run out of resources. Now you feel very differently about fights. Now you're like, I do not want to get in a fight. I do not have the resources to fight. I desperately need to not die. Maybe I'll try running. And you fight a fight, and you make $1,000. And you're like, I don't care. Money is not the priority here. And so you're fighting a completely different set of fights than you were at the entrance because now your focus is completely different. Your priorities have completely changed. You might be fighting the same monsters, but you are not feeling the same things. And if you're doing like a boss encounter thing where you're trying to reach the boss, well, then you're trying to avoid fights. You have the resources to fight these fights, but you don't want to waste it because you're saving them up for the boss. And then you like spend a bunch and you're like, oh no, I had to spend a bunch of resources. Do I go back and like rest and try again? Or do I push on even though I'm not going to be in my best condition? Or do I spend those very expensive super elixirs that everyone has 10 of at the end of every game? So how the dungeon is laid out radically changes how the player will feel at any given point in the dungeon. Now, sure, you can use any dungeon as a grind dungeon, and you can do a boss rush in any dungeon, and you can get lost and really run out of resources and get in danger in any dungeon. But how the dungeon is laid out will make those things happen more frequently in specific areas and in specific progressions. So you're guiding the player through these sorts of themes, through these sorts of frames, on purpose. For example, you might put some screw you fire pits here. And now when the player comes through here, they're like, oh gosh, we just took a ton of damage. There is no way we're going to be grinding for XP down in this arm. We're just going to try and figure out what's here and then get back across the screw you fire pits. And we're going to need to keep our health intact, and this is going to be, tough. Down here, there is a healing pit that heals you up. And they're like, yeah, well, we'll just grind here forever. Or when we're going to the boss, we'll stop in here and then go up to the boss. Oh, look, here's some traps. But after you go through them, they get disarmed. So that's interesting. Or they're traps that only get armed when the boss is in the dungeon. So there are a lot of interesting things you can do to change how the player will feel about the fights they get in. What you're doing is you're manipulating the resources that the player has and the things that the player feels in order to get them to think about fights differently. Well, there are a lot of things that get players to think about fights differently, right? I mean, if you're talking about what makes fights different from other fights, there's millions of differences, like level and party and monsters and health and mana and I don't know, cash and potions. And maybe you have terrain because you're a tactical game. And how about distance from save? And how about poison? And how about how long before Mom turns off the PlayStation? All of these things change how you feel about fights. Are they all framing devices? No. A framing device uses these, but these are not framing devices in and of themselves. The framing device's purpose is to give the dev a scaffold, a foundation from which they can build a player experience. So the concept of monsters is not necessarily a framing device because it's unlikely that the dev is going to be building a framework of monsters that guides the player through specific experiences. Instead, the monsters will be used by a framework to inflict specific experiences, say, by a dungeon. Now, why am I hammering on this? Why does it matter? Well, one of the big things that's worth considering is how are you designing your dungeons? If your dungeons are intended to be framing devices, then they're intended to guide the player through a number of different frames. They're intended to reframe the experience of the player and the fights that are in the dungeon by manipulating all of these aspects, like how far you are from a save and how hurt you are and how easy it is to refill health. All of these things guide the player's experience, and the point of a dungeon is to allow the dev to put together that experience and stretch those fights. That fight gameplay has a lot more legs if it is being seeded into this framework. So when you're building a dungeon, that's what you should be thinking about. Not how long does it have to be, or how many endless corridors do I need to have, but what is the player going to think? How is the player going to feel? What are their resources going to be, and how is that going to make them react? Can I make them feel differently about fights in this area than they feel about fights in a different area? What can I change to make them feel that way? Can I burn their legs off? Hurt them? Can I make them slower? Can I throw different monsters at them? Can I make one of their party members leave temporarily? Can I give them a new party member temporarily, or maybe permanently? All of those are resources that can be manipulated within a dungeon to make the player feel differently about the fights within the dungeon. What might be another framing device that's in use by an RPG? Well, the shopping system. That's a little bit vague because it includes like levels and stuff, but anything that you spend in order to gain more resources falls into this category. So, it's things like XP, which you spend to gain levels, and cash, which you spend to gain armor, and in the reverse order, scales that you give away to gain cash. So as always, the point to reframing these things, there are three pieces: how the player goes into the fight, how the player fights the fight, and how the player comes out of the fight. And the shopping system can influence all three of those. How the player goes into the fight. Do they have the most recent armor? Do they have a need for cash? Those will change how they feel about any given fight. When they're in the fight, are they going to have to spend an expensive expendable? It's going to change how they fight. When they come out of the fight, how much money did they get? How many resources did they get that they can trade for money? These are things which will change how the players feel about the fight, and a clever dev will use the shopping system to seed in these experiences. It's like, yeah, Town A sells you slingshots and swords. Town B sells you rapiers and bows. Town C sells you flaming sabers and ice axes. And by those progressions, the player can feel differently about the fights that they're going through. They can save money differently. They can save up money or spend money. They can save up resources or spend resources. They can aim at different kinds of resources, like focusing on experience or focusing on cash. So these are reframing devices. These are framing devices that reframe the gameplay. Not everything has to be aimed at that core gameplay, though. For example, your plot or world map could be considered to be a framing device for these guys. And there are things that are not within this scaffold, like towns. Are towns a framing device? Not really. They don't really have anything to do with the fights. They're just another part of the game. They're great for pacing. They're great for you trying to make the player go through other things besides the fight, but they don't directly affect the fights most of the time. They don't reframe the fights. If you wanted to try and do that, you're welcome to. You could also consider this to be like the plots might be reframing the towns and stuff. That might be going a little bit like, you don't need to go that deep, because the point of this is you're trying to figure out how to extend the experiences you're having without feeling cheap or boring. So the only time you really need to really focus on that is when you're planning to use the same things over and over. And a fight is the same things over and over and over. Towns, generally you have new actual assets for each town. At least I hope you do. And therefore you don't really need a reframing device because the towns are their own experience. They are unfolding at their own rate with their own resources, and they don't need to be reframed. At least in theory. I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of these reframing devices because I haven't mentioned legs. This is a fairly basic concept that is worth talking about. When you're building a framing device, there are two basic methods that you want to consider. So for example, with a dungeon, you want to consider how the player feels when they go in and how the player feels when they go out. How they fight within the fight is also worth considering, but I generally consider that kind of secondary. How they go into the fight is something that is fun. It's something that you can brainstorm all day, and you can be like, yeah, now we're gonna throw new monsters at them. Or, oh, look, that save point, you could only use it once. Who knew? Right? So you can do a whole bunch of stuff to get the players to feel differently when they're going into the fight. Because all you have to do is make the players feel like their resources are worth a different amount. But how the players come out of the fight is a little bit more tough to conceptualize, at least for me. So I can make the players feel differently going into a fight, but I want them to have a different set of values coming out of the fight. How do I make them value things differently? Because that's how you get them to play differently. If they come out the other side with different resources, depending on how they play, then they're going to play differently. So this is where I use the concept of legs. And all that means is things the players can get. It's basically different kinds of resources that have different ways of being used. So for example, coming out of this, you can have HP, you can have mana, and you can have cash. So this is a three-legged framing device. When you're coming out of the fights, you're standing on one or more of those three legs, and that's all that you care about. So by making it so the players value HP, mana, and cash differently, I can make them fight differently because they're going to want to preserve or obtain as much of one of those resources as possible. And that's a lot of fun to make vary more over the course of a dungeon than over the course of a game. A lot of games really bake it in, and they're like, yeah, mana's always more important than health. I think it's more fun to make the dungeon the arbiter of that, because then you can really make the players stop and be like, okay, hold on. I actually want to spend mana like water right now because I need health. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. For example, constant damage effects, or a mana lockdown where they can't regenerate mana, or where they can't regenerate health, rather. There are lots of ways to make health matter more than mana. And similarly with cash, not necessarily within the dungeon with the cash, although that's also possible, but the cash is a leg that you can make have value, more or less value, depending on how you've set up the game, and how you've set up the situation around the dungeon. Well, that's the shopping. So the shopping also has legs. Cash, for example. How about XP? Yeah, that sounds like it's good too. Shopping doesn't really care about HP or mana though. Except, it cares about them going in. It doesn't care about them coming out. How much HP or mana you've got coming out of a fight, the shop doesn't care. but the shop will help you so that you have more going into a fight. Yeah, just give the shop some cash and they'll give you some armor. Yep. So once again, we're talking about how we come out of the fight, not how we go in. Because that's how I feel is easiest. It's easy to go into a fight in a fun way. But coming out, you want to make sure that those fights have different values. So in the end, I would say that this is how it's set up. We've got 2 legs for the dungeon system and 2 legs for the shopping system. You might have a different set of opinions or a different design philosophy, but this is how I think about it when I'm trying to make gameplay that feels interesting for the player. I change how things are going in by just brainstorming and having fun with it, and I change how things are coming out by using this leg system and simply varying which of these legs the player cares about most. I'm not 100% sure that this video will be terribly helpful, but feel free to comment below and maybe I'll make another one if it turns out that this one didn't quite hit the mark and was too confusing or whatever.